Hi everyone, I'm Atul Vashistha and I'm the Chairman and CEO of Supply Wisdom. I'm delighted to be here today at CefPro, and today I'll be talking about the future of risk management is automated, particularly all the way from risk identification to risk mitigation. As we think about today's world, one of the biggest things you're starting to notice is how, as enterprises use more and more third parties, as their base of third parties and suppliers is rising, their disruptions, business disruptions are also rising. And they're rising in both severity and frequency. And it's humanly not possible to be able to identify all these risks, and then more importantly, to be able to mitigate them. And this is where automation plays a role, and particularly where Supply Wisdom plays a role across the full spectrum of risk. And so it's not enough to just monitor and manage financial and cyber risk, but one also needs to monitor and manage compliance, operations, ESG, nth party, and also locations. For example, if you look at the last 2.5 years, what you notice is that risks that have occurred, that have created significant supply chain disruptions over the last 2.5 years, often started as location-based risks. COVID, China Zero, COVID policy, war in Ukraine, and then they cascaded to the financial health, operations, compliance, cyber health of our third parties. And so one has to look at how could you automate so that you get accurate, timely, real-time, continuous information across all these risks on your third parties. How can you assess them, again, using automated systems? And then how do you engage all those with workflow systems so you can actually initiate a number of automated risk actions? And I think that's possible today. And so that's one of the things I want to talk about today in my session. And I look forward to any questions and any kind of feedback from you. Thank you. What I'm going to try and do over the next 30 minutes, and I encourage you to please stop me, jump in, ask questions, or share your point of view, is really focus on how can you actually automate risk management today, not in the future, but today, all the way from risk mitigation, right, which is your outcome, starting at risk identification. How can you identify risk automatically, and how can you actually mitigate risks automatically? So just to kind of set the stage, when you think about what I'm trying to do, so you understand the perspective that we're coming from, is I started this company in 2017 with the express purpose of, as companies are growing, expanding, one of the key things that they do is they're leveraging more and more third parties, suppliers, partners, and others. When they do that, the amount of risk that they face because of their third party also rises. And we have tremendous amount of data that shows that not only is this risk rising, but it's also more frequent and it's also becoming more severe. So how do you, in that environment, actually deal with that where it's becoming humanly impossible to be able to manage all those risks because these are happening in real time? So before I begin, I wanted to just take a quick poll. And is this poll also happening on the RE22?
It is, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So, think about your intelligence budget for the last 2 years. And when you think about 2022 and beyond, are those budgets actually rising? Are they the same, or they're declining? One of the biggest reasons I'm asking this question is because one of the things we're trying to figure out based on the last session, are people really paying attention to risk management more today than they were pre-COVID, during COVID? Or is it one of those things that tend to pass again? So I'll take another just 10 seconds. Right. So one of our predictions was, and I think time will tell, that with potential recession or downturn, as you look into it, there's many areas where budgets will decrease. But if we've learned any lessons from the last 2 years, you would see risk management budgets either remain the same or potentially would increase because we're still seeing significant supply chain disruptions. Again, thank you for that. So let me just kind of talk about, make sure everybody's on the same page regarding third-party relationships. So one of the key things we notice is disruptions are rising in frequency and severity, right? At the same time, if you look at risk management practices, what have they done? They have largely been driven by survey instruments. So this information is at a point in time, and the moment that survey is completed, takes too long, very manual, looks at very limited issues, typically cyber only, or financial health. Go back to the last couple of disruptions. Go back to the last couple of years, and what do you start to see? COVID. This is zero COVID policy in China, shutting down cities, factories being shut down. Climate impact. Think about the floods in Germany. Think about the typhoons in Manila, rains in Bangalore, and so on and so forth. And then on top of that, you're starting to see, because of all these reasons, ships sitting at ports not being able to deliver goods, and then rising inflation. And then you start to add cyber attacks, and then finally, one more change that caused tremendous supply chain disruptions from all kinds of areas. It's not just wheat, but gas that's required in semiconductors, dye that's used in MRIs, in X-ray, and others. So what we're starting to see is that supply chain disruptions have increased tremendously, and the factors that are taking place are actually more diverse than we've ever seen before. So how do you keep up with all this change, all this constantly evolution that's happening, by only relying on cyber and health? You start to see different areas, different risk vectors constantly taking place. And these are not just based on your third parties, but even the locations where these third parties are actually providing you services. So how do you monitor all those risks in real time continuously through humans, or is that even possible? And then one of the key things you're trying to do in any organization is look at all these risks, not just during ongoing risk management, but trying to make that really part of your first line of defense in your sourcing and procurement. So how do you understand that risk? Not that survey or that assessment that was done 3 months, 6 months, 12 months ago, but you're doing sourcing right now. So how do I understand that risk right now? The ability to do risk scans that are right now, immediate, real time, and then to be able to do that as risk changes over a period of time. So really trying to do risk management from sourcing all the way to ongoing vendor management, third-party management, to, of course, then being able to offboard those that are not working out for you, where the risk is no longer acceptable, and being able to replace that very, very quickly. So that becomes really the kind of challenges that we're trying to deal with in today's world. Whenever we've done studies of major cyber incidents as an example, or major financial incidents as an example, if you go back 6 months, 9 months, you could actually detect risk in another vector. So for example, if you look at solar winds, what you notice is that there were examples of reduction in cyber spending, reduction, movement, loss of critical employees, moving the operations to locations that were high cyber risk. So if you're taking risk mitigation steps during those period of times, very potentially you avoid problems later on. I'm going to stop there before I start talking about kind of the example of how can one actually use automated risk management from risk identification to risk mitigation, to see if anybody has any comments or questions, or whether you disagree with my theory, or these examples we've used where risk is rising in both frequency and severity. So we need a real-time continuous risk management system. So I think we're all on the same page that it's not enough to just automate some processes. We need to think about how do you automate all the way from risk identification to risk mitigation. So let's talk about some. I think today, the way automation and data science exists today makes it possible today. Imagine a change in risk, right? That change in risk could be a financial health. It could be a potential typhoon that can restrict employees from going into work. It could be an announcement about the fact that certain equipment is no longer available that creates a weakness. It could be an announcement about a potential change because of an election in a certain country and how that might cascade to other risk. The moment you get that risk notice, the ability to take that, inform you immediately through our mobile devices, any kind of system possible today, it is also possible today to train our systems to actually take action. And hopefully I'm going to kind of walk you through how some of that actually takes place. So think about applying machine learning particularly today. I won't use the words AI because a lot of this is really early stage AI. But machine learning, as you heard on some of the sessions this morning, it's about the training database, which is, do you actually have accurate information that can now train the next data that's coming in real time continuously, which we do. I think many of us do actually. So if you can actually automate the ability to get data in, to be able to look at that data, again automatically, to assess truth of that data, sentiment of that data, and then also to assess the impact of that data. So if it is a typhoon about to hit Manila 5 days from now, there's historical information that says that when a certain level typhoon hits Manila, employees cannot go to work. So what's the risk mitigation companies take? What have they done historically? They issue laptops. They issue soft security tokens. They ensure that the location of employees are in area where internet is stable. They issue them internet devices, basically Wi-Fi hotspots or others, and they've been able to mitigate the risk of that person not able to work that day, just as an example. All that can be done automatically, whether it's issuance of laptops, issuance of security tokens, issuance of any kind of a network, internet security device. All that that can be automated. And then the massive amounts of being able to cleanse that data so you can ascertain truth. The fact that you can assess sentiment and then based on historical data, and especially if you have the understanding of all these risk elements. So if you're only looking at cyber risk, your problem is when a financial event happens or a management event happens, you cannot predict cyber risk because you did not interrelate all those different risk domains. So the way to do that automatically is to be able to actually do full spectrum continuous monitoring. If you're not doing that, your information is absolutely incomplete. When I talk to corporations today and I say, what area of risk domains do you monitor continuously today? Typically, there's only one domain that they monitor continuously today. And that's which one? That's right. So cyber is the only area that they monitor today, but how can you be assured that you are protected if you're not monitoring the other elements continuously? I remember this. We issued an alert on COVID to our customers on January 2nd. It was called Wuhan viral pneumonia. We gave customers 2 guidance on January 2nd. One was, you may need to quarantine employees. And number 2 is you need to connect with state and health officials to understand the rules and regulations related to it. Can you imagine if you had taken action on January 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th? When was the earliest your corporations started to send people work from home? For most, it was in February or March. Imagine if you had started to procure laptops on January 3rd and 4th, or internet devices. Think about all the other things you could have done, right? Companies didn't do that. But they had that warning because these companies were monitoring full spectrum risk.
The problem is, sometimes when the data is sparse, you're asking for really big decisions on sparse data. That's not easy to do.
So the reality actually is data is actually not sparse. It feels sparse because you're only looking at one element in most companies. But when you interrelate all these dimensions, you realize very quickly that you actually have very accurate data. Now, there's another piece lacking, and I'll talk about that. So actually, the interesting part is access to data is actually a lot easier, but the ability to interrelate it and then to decide what action to take is actually a lot difficult. But I'm going to talk about like how you can actually do that and really have a lot of this automated. So first is, I want to make this point. If there's one thing I want you to take away today is you can no longer monitor risk or manage risk by simply looking at only 1 or 2 risk domains. You can't. All you have to do is take a look at the last 2.5 years, right? So when somebody thinks about that China is following a zero COVID policy, which means cities shut down, no manufacturing, ports don't open, right? Nobody can go to work. What is the impact of that? If I'm GE Medical and my die factory happens to be on the outskirts of Shanghai, and guess what I do? I shut down the factory. Do you know what's the next impact of that is? Well, if you don't follow a location closure, you may never know that GE Medical is no longer making dies for a few days in that factory. What that means is your downstream supply chain is now impacted, and hospitals are not getting that die. So which means for the next 2 weeks, if I'm a hospital, I realize I may not be able to do any MRIs for 2 weeks, or whatever that may be. So imagine that hospital needs to be monitoring that level of news to understand the downstream impact. So please remember this. One is you have to look at full spectrum risk if you truly want to do good risk management in today's world. The next piece is, and this, I think there's a number of companies out there, by the way, that do news, leverage machine learning on news. So collect millions of pieces of data, and then they actually send it to you as alerts so that you can take a look at it. The reality of that is they're actually performing probably 50%, 70% better than you could do with your manual efforts. But the reality is all you're doing is you're just getting better news at the end of the day, right? So they validate truth. Often they are validating sentiment. The reality is most of them are not assessing impact. To move to the next stage of leveraging of this machine learning to be more efficient, you have to be able to know what the impact is, and your systems have to be able to recognize that. There's a big difference between if there's a typhoon in Manila, right, and it happens to be you're subscribing to Accenture, but your facility that you use, if Accenture happens to be in Mexico City, so that alert in Manila is irrelevant to you, as an example, right? These news services often don't make that kind of determination. So you need somebody who can actually take you all the way from truth to sentiment to actually assess impact that's particular to you or to your environment that you're functioning in. And so there's systems today that can absolutely do that. So, right, I mean, the other thing is to be able to do it continuously in real time, right? This is not a day later, not a month later, not a quarter later, but actually do this in real time. And then when you're starting to understand it, make sure that the other part is that your AI models or machine learning models are not stable. What I mean by that is that you might use any one of these models. We just put a few up there. But as data changes, as your other risks changes, we inside our company, we call it dynamic risk, because risk really is truly changing. You want to make sure you're constantly evolving machine learning models. And then we had another discussion this morning about regulators and clients asking for more transparency on machine learning models. So if you're changing machine learning models, how do you ensure that you continue this level of transparency? So that's the other thing you just have to keep in mind as you go through that. So if you have solid machine learning models, you can actually assess impact, right? We have models going for the last 10 years that we're able to take any incident in real time, and our system is able to actually assess, is that a low, moderate, high, critical? The more the customer tells you, the more you tell the system, the more it's actually able to make it more accurate for you. We've retained, for example, 93% accuracy. And then to be able to deliver that to a customer, not just as an event alert, but actually be able to give them a metric, a rating, along with the alert. Well, what difference does that make if you have a metric? So for example, is cash flow rising or declining for that company, right? Is there patch management and a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being risky, 1 low risk? Did it go from 6 to 8 or did it go from 10 to 8, right? The trend. And then finally, of course, the risk event. Well, the biggest reason why all this helps you is you can now start training your systems in terms of what actions should automatically be triggered. So now you're moving from risk identification, risk assessment, to actually now risk mitigation. I just threw up a few samples for just easy understanding. I mean, there's a lot of complexity that you can build in here. And the thing I was talking about before is I think what a lot of companies haven't done is really developed a comprehensive playbook that identifies when a certain risk is identified, to be able to put a trigger on it. That trigger could be a change in a metric by 20%. Or a trigger could be is if it reaches a scale of 8 out of 10, that the following action is triggered. No response, no change. And again, remember the system can continue to track and see whether risk mitigation is undertaken or not. If a supplier fixes the patch, updates email security, or others, the system detects it and then basically removes that as a risk. And this is where you're starting to now take a risk that's been identified to be able to accurately assess it and then to be able to actually trigger an action, all done through systems. I'll talk a little bit about kind of what systems do you need to be able to do that to see if it's... Now, all this can be leveraged when you do risk assessments. What we have seen is that for most companies that do risk assessment, whether that's 100 questions or 800 questions, anywhere from about 60 to 80% can be automated today based on the data that's publicly available, but that's being run by the system, and be able to make those assessments real time as of right now, not data month old, quarter old, or a year old. And then, of course, to be able to continuously monitor it. So imagine moving your risk management programs based on your appetite to a risk-based scenario, which is your actions are based on the risks as they are seen at a moment in time, not a long time ago. Most companies today take their third-party base and tier into most critical and high, medium and low, and they come up with some level of frequency. The critical and high, they usually do an assessment once a year. Well, what's the latest guidance from EPA, SEC, EBA, SEC, just look at all the regulators. The most common word that's being used is ongoing monitoring, right? They want you to be able to monitor your third-party based risk on a real-time, ongoing basis and not do assessments. Once a year is not continuous. Continuous is ongoing all the time. So finally, just a couple more things that I wanted to see. If you go to your survey again, one of the things I'm trying to understand is how many of you are moving to continuous real-time monitoring on risk domains, on any of those risk domains that we showed you. So I'm trying to see here is, are there other people that are adopting continuous monitoring in risk domains outside of cyber? So we have many people in the audience that are incredible risk experts. There's a couple that I want to just point out, Andrew Moyat and Robin Slade from Shared Assessments. They really started this whole movement towards how can we look at risk in a more standardized way so that you can actually leverage the same information across companies. And I think some of the systems that we're talking about are trying to do that and leverage automation to do that. Andrew, Robin, hey. So this is really interesting that a third of you are saying that you are actually monitoring ESG and compliance risk on a real-time, continuous basis. Those of you who are doing that, if you send me an email, I would love to talk to you because I have yet to see clients outside of our company do ESG risk monitoring on a real-time basis. So I would love to hear from you because to me that I would love to find those solutions that are actually doing that. I think the financial and cyber kind of makes the case that I talked about earlier, that companies often limit their risk identification or risk exposure to really those two elements. The one that worries me the most, and this is one that I've spoke about quite a bit, is the fact that location risk, right? Location risk, if you look at the last 2.5 years, what were the biggest risks that were faced by companies across the globe? COVID, location-based risk, right? Think about all the port issues, closure of cities in China, location-based risk. War on Ukraine, location-based risk. So we've had the biggest supply chain disruptions in the last 2.5 years based on location, and look at the state of what our continuous real-time monitoring programs are. I think for a lot of us, this is troubling, but it also tells you there's a great opportunity to take advantage of that. Thank you for this. So let me just end by a couple of different slides to kind of talk you through how you can actually make it possible today with many of the systems that exist today. So the first piece that companies need today is the ability to make sure your risk intelligence access is from a player that's real-time and continuous. A player that enables you to look at full domain, make sure it's real-time and continuous, full spectrum so you can look at all risks, but really is able to give you not just the news, but actually give it to you with not just sentiment, but also impact. So because that's what enables you to actually start triggering through workflow systems. This is where most likely you're invested in a ServiceNow, Coupa, Archer, OneTrust, right? This is your workflow software, or maybe a homegrown tool for that matter. That intelligence feeds into that workflow system. Because of a metric, a risk rating, or a risk event alert, it can actually trigger a risk mitigation action. Or if you want humans involved, because this is a risk that it's a much more complex risk, is you have an incident management system, a kind of a risk operations center. Think about kind of, in IT, often you'll see NOCs or network operating centers. It's very similar to that, but these are risk experts that are together and really multi-discipline. So this might have sourcing, cyber, risk management, operational risk, and other parties together so that you can actually mitigate risk across the company. And then finally, involving your vendor also in that risk mitigation, of course, and then continuously feeding it back into your system so that your accuracy continuously improves. We saw accuracy in companies that are doing that at the beginning of COVID in the mid-60s to by the end of COVID in the high 90s accuracy in their ability to manage and monitor and mitigate that entire risk. And then finally, for those of you who are still skeptics in this room, one of the things I want to leave you with is when we start to see the benefit. So often people think about technology as an added investment, significant investment. It is absolutely paying for itself because the risk management process today is so manual. It requires so many people to do risk assessments and then risk response that with automation you can reduce that spend very, very dramatically. You don't remove humans from this whole process. The best combination is ML, AI plus humans because there is a lot of complex risk that you do want humans to make the final decision whether you want to mitigate it or not. And so not only do you see great response from regulators, because regulators are asking you to have a disciplined risk management process and to have good response mechanisms, right? And you're able to do that. The early warning enables you to mitigate and avoid a significant amount of risk. And then, like I said before, because of the reduction in manual effort, you actually overall reduce your overall risk management spend while ensuring both management boards and regulators that you're actually much more aware of the risk and you have much better risk mitigation in place. I'm going to just stop there and see if you have any questions, comments, or if anybody wants to share kind of their experience in this area.
That's all. I thought you did a great presentation. And I like what you're doing. But one thing you didn't touch on, maybe because of time, you mentioned noise, right? But there's a difference between noise and corruption. So sentiment analysis, example where if you're using Twitter, 20% of the accounts are fake, right? So how do you get to the truth?
Yeah.
And robustness of the models.
Yeah.
Data corruption.
Yeah. So I think this is the beauty of machine learning models, that both when you use metrics and ratings and events, and when any information comes in, it basically compares to historical information, and as long as it has good thresholds, it is able to then basically say, is this meeting the threshold or not? And if it crosses the threshold, this is where we actually ourselves, we involve humans in our case. That's why I say you cannot remove humans, you reduce the amount. So in that case, anything that's triggered as a potential issue, you want a human to look into it. And what we're finding, like I said, prior to COVID, 35% of the time humans were involved in that process. We're finding it to be less than 10% today because of the accuracy that's built into the system. So you have to invest humans to make your machine learning models much more accurate. Please go ahead.
Let's just follow on from that. I was saying, if there was a typhoon in Manila, and your team was in Manila, and your first response was, well, don't worry, I've got some laptops for you. I guess you're kind of introducing a people risk. So your first response for you all alive, family okay. There's that risk as well you're introducing with an automated response to some of these situations. I guess that makes you, particularly in an ESG world, perhaps not the most caring boss.
So you're making an assumption that because that's one of the response to operations that the company is ignoring the employees. I'm not sure I would. So remember, in that perfect operation, the human risk, right, which is taking care of families and others, that is not, risk management is not doing that, but if you're distributing that information within the company properly, which means HR has access to that same information while risk management does, you're hoping HR takes that action at the same time. Because you're right, and in some cases, you may have issues of flooding where forget about having a laptop and the ability to work on the internet, you simply cannot, right, just because of that. But so one of the things what we're seeing in these companies is that when you have subscriptions like this, they actually encourage use in different parts of the company. So from HR to risk management to IT and others. So that each area, each group is able to manage that. One of the things, if I can show you this. If you take a look at this right here, one of the things you'll notice right here, for example, is workforce. Right, so it actually assumes that in your playbook, you've actually mapped all those and not just thinking of this as what's your third-party response or what's your employee response with a laptop. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore it, but the fact that it's actually, it's actually covered. Yeah, but good point.
You sort of touched on this, but I'd just like to drill into this a little bit, right? So you're building up a new bank from scratch, a brand new code base, loads of really keen people who've done their data analysis courses and so on. I can see how this would work. When you look at a mature bank, where different silos have been doing their workflows in completely different ways, and that's just what they're used to, there must be a lot of challenges in looking at the upstream operating models for each risk silo and how they're going to generate data in a way that allows this to work. Can you expand a bit on your experience of that and how people are adapting? Because they're clearly effective.
Yeah. So when you adopt full spectrum monitoring, there's a number of ways to do it. So one of the largest, I'll give you an example, one of the largest wealth management companies globally, the way they did it is they actually formed a third-party governance group. So they have a dedicated third-party governance group to deal with, particularly with risk management and response. So in that case, they're benefiting from the fact that all this data, they're getting across all the 7 risk domains and they can take action on it. I have an example of an insurance company, again, a global insurance company where it's absolutely siloed. Compliance has its own action, compliance does its own, IT has its own, and then you have financial risk is in procurement. In that case, what they are actually done is, if you notice there were 7 risk domains, each is getting access to the risk domain that matters to them. And then they do have a third-party risk management group that actually gets the integrated dashboard. Complexity there is how do you make sure you monitor the risk actions that each department is taking? One of the ways they have done it is they have an instance of Archer in this case as an example. So they're able to actually see all those views in a single place in Archer, even though it's being done by different silos within the company.
So the solution for the silos is to build another silo?
No, it's not it. It's actually integrated.
Management unit who governs the risk, right? The outsourcing.
No, but this is integrated. You're actually building an integrated view on top of the silos to get past those silos. So I think of this as progress. If you go into a company that's been around for 100 years, the way they are doing it, the approach they basically take is I'm not going to go and rip and replace everything, right? So show me a way that I can get an integrated view, and then I'll change management within the company to work with these silos to start collaborating with each other. But at least have a group that has a single view, integrated view of the entire organization. It's like, so I think a lot of software companies have done that. They put an overlay, right, on all these different systems to provide a singular view. It's a similar approach to that.
So do you often, and I'll stop after this, right, but do you often find cases where the different silos might be individually flashing amber, but there's enough going on that at the top level you would look at that and say, something bad is going to happen here, that there's something significant happening?
Oh, it's very much so. It's like, think about, you get an early warning in a certain domain, it is shared with that silo, but the silo has no playbook to actually take action based on that. Absolutely, yeah. We have a long way to go, as you could see from the survey. In spite of all the risk we've seen in the last 2.5 years, only 8% are monitoring location risk. I mean, how is that possible that we're in this state today after what we've experienced in the last 2.5 years?
I think we're going to need to wrap there. Once again, thank you very much, Atul.
Thank you. So finally, some of the lessons you want to take away or learnings you want to take away are look at risk full spectrum. So don't just limit yourself to financial and cyber, but full spectrum. Make sure your risk systems, risk intelligence is continuous and in real time. and then make sure that you are leveraging your workflow systems to be able to automate all the way from risk identification to risk mitigation. And that requires you to have a good playbook so you can automate that entire process. Thank you.